My name is Chelsea, and I'm going to sort of kick things off here. So you know who I am. I am a PhD student. I study labor history at NC State University in Raleigh. I am also a proud member of the UE Local 150. That's part of the NC State Graduate Workers chapter. I hope you've seen the news at some point. We're dealing with a lot on our campus. Our buildings are incredibly contaminated with PCBs, and we've had hundreds of reports of cancers and other illnesses. And so that's something that our local has been really engaged in. And hope we will have something from the university at some point. But I'm really glad to be here with all of you tonight and welcome everyone to the first session of this three-part series on the Southern Key with the author, Michael Goldfield. And before we get started, for those who don't already know, the Southern Workers Assembly is a network of local unions, worker organizations, and organizing committees who are committed to building rank-and-file democratic social movement unionism as a foundation for organizing, uniting, and transforming labor power through the South. And just in May, the Southern Workers Assembly held a workers' school in Charlotte, North Carolina, that gathered, I think, close to 170 workers and activists. And one of the main action items that came out of the assembly was the need for more political education. And so this series on the Southern Key is trying to offer that education to, really bring the highest level of organizing in our workplaces and throughout the South. So Mike Goldfield is here with us tonight. He's worked extensively as a labor and civil rights activist and also written widely on labor, race relations, and the economy. He has written several books, including The Color of Politics, Race and the Mainsprings of American Politics, and The Decline of Organized Labor in the United States, and of course, The Southern Key. So we're really excited to have him here with us tonight. And a little logistics before I hand it over to Mike. He's going to give a brief presentation, and then we'll open up the discussion. So we'll do a combination of raising the hand feature in Zoom. So you can either raise your hand if you want to speak, and I'll kind of call on people in order, but you can also put things in the chat and we'll occasionally go over the chat too. So whatever you want to do and are more comfortable with, but I hope it'll be a good discussion. So with that, I will hand it over to Mike.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chelsea, and to the Southern Workers Congress for inviting me. I want to give sort of a brief overview of things with the goal of sort of facilitating discussion. I'm assuming, or at least hoping, that many of you have read the chapter which been assigned. So, and I have PowerPoint just to facilitate things and hopefully entertain people a little bit. So, let's see. So, my argument in the book is that Southern labor is the key to understanding and changing American society, and this starts historically. The South has a legacy of slavery and white supremacy, going back before the Civil War, but continuing in the form of sharecropping and Jim Crow and segregation up until the 1960s, if not longer, and still cast its shadow over many things in the South today. Specifically, the South, compared to other parts of the country, tends to have a disregard for human life. Over 80% of the 1,460 executions, at least that's a figure from 2020-21, since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, have been in the South, with over half of them in 3 states alone: Texas, Oklahoma, and Virginia. The South has the lowest level and the lowest support for public education and health care. In 2015, 17.1% of Texans had no health insurance, nearly double the national average. And while the national average has gone down, the disparities are even worse than the data that I have here. And the lack of working class organization has tended to lead to atomization, individualism, and increased receptivity to manipulation of ideas by dominant economic interests. As a result, the South is a region with the largest percentage of people are birthers, meaning they thought Barack Obama was not a U.S. citizen. That seems to have receded. People reject evolution, the existence of global warming, etc. But none of this is to argue that the South is all bad. South has played a significant enriching role in American literature. It's the site of many great universities. And there are actually far more African-American PhDs from institutions in the South than in the allegedly more liberal and racially tolerant North. And it's also the area which I try to document a bit in the Southern Key, where some of the country's most violent and militant popular struggles have taken place. Blacks and whites in parts of Mississippi engaged in guerrilla war against the Confederacy, and interracial labor organizing, when there was a high price to pay for it, took place throughout the South in the 19th and early 20th century, first under the banner of the Knights of Labor, later the Industrial Workers of the World. The interracial labor battles of the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1970s civil rights struggles taking place in the South are inspirational beacons to all of us. And there are a lot of myths about Southern workers. A lot of it is in the academic literature that the reason unionization is lower in the South because Southern workers are allegedly individualistic, submissive to authority figures. But if you look at the history of Southern labor, there are periods when a great deal of militancy and solidarity took place. During the 30s and 40s, as industrial workers across the country organized, this took place across the South. And I'd like to highlight Alabama in particular, which after World War II had 26% unionization rate, higher than any state in the United States today. So this Alabama exceptionalism involved workers across the board, steel workers, woodworkers, even in one county, not only teachers, but school principals were unionized. And this militancy was led by coal miners. So here's a picture of coal miners outside of Birmingham, going down into the mines in 1937. One thing highlight, and this is relevant for how we look at things today, is that I suggest that there are two types of power that workers have. One is structural power. It's the type of leverage they have in relation to the economic system. And associational power, the support of various allies that helps advance the struggle of particular groups of workers. So during this period in the 30s and 40s, there was success in Mississippi. And particularly in Alabama, unions organized wall to wall. The coal miners in particular tried to organize everybody else, even though they had a lot of structural power, a lot of leverage. They used that to help everyone else. Textile workers who unions had trouble organizing in many parts of the South were all organized in Alabama at one point. Here's a headline from the Gadsden Times, which is almost a heavy industrial area almost completely 100% organized during the 1940s and early 1950s. Today, as Ben has particularly noted in a recent piece that he wrote in Labor Notes, the industrial composition of the South is changing. Coal and textile have pretty much mostly disappeared. Some industries remain strong. In Louisiana and Texas, oil workers are there, but the spread of particularly auto assembly plants, and as Ben notes, battery plants, is really extensive throughout the South. Here's a picture of the Mercedes plant, which many of you have seen. I have a T-shirt from the organizing campaign there. This is and this is one that the union, the auto workers narrowly lost. Again, this is from the Amazon campaign outside of Birmingham, the successful campaign at Volkswagen, and for associative power in Chattanooga, and we can discuss what difference it made. These are unionized school teachers in Chattanooga who are supporting the auto workers organizing campaign. And surprisingly, in the last year, the state that grew whose unionization grew the most was Texas, one of those deep South states that are not very pro-union. As it mentions here, 60,000 workers joined the unions in 2023. That's about a third of workers who join unions in the country as a whole. And there's also been militancy, successful, even outside of the auto assembly and the battery and the truck and bus plants. This is a flyer from a successful catfish plant organizing campaign in Mississippi. And even though the auto workers failed to organize the plant in Georgetown, Kentucky, the Toyota plant in Georgetown, Kentucky, construction workers, through much more militant tactics, successfully forced the company to hire only union labor to build the plant, and all the skilled jobs within the plant are unionized. And after a series of demonstrations and exposés, tactics that the auto workers at that time were more than hesitant, didn't want to engage in, the construction unions did. And then I want to mention that even though laws seem unfavorable in many ways to unions organizing, the argument that I give in the Southern Key is that favorable laws play a very secondary role. So I want to mention also not just the laws, but in fact, there's a lot of media attention to what Southern Republican governors and other elected officials do in terms of denouncing unions. In general, those type of tactics, and we can see that certainly in the 30s and 40s, have very little leverage compared to what anti-union activities that companies might do inside the plants. The story that I tell in the Southern Key is how major unions abandoned the struggle for civil rights. The McCarthy period and the red baiting helped destroy many of the more racially egalitarian unions, and we can discuss what difference it makes. Here's some pictures. This isn't a very good one, but one of the very militant civil rights-oriented locals was in Louisville, Kentucky. The farm equipment workers, a radical union. This is a picture of a picket line from 1947. And then in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Local 22 of the tobacco workers, one had several strikes There's a book about them called Civil Rights Unionism. So I'm going to stop right here and open it up to questions, but I have a series of questions which were distributed, which I think, Ben, people got them, right?
Yeah, they should have gotten them by email.
Okay, I'm going to end the slideshow. And so I'll open it up, and you can ask other questions too, but I figured I'd start with the questions that I gave initially. So why were the coal miners the first to organize in the early 1930s, even before there was legislation that helped unions? And maybe related to that, what type of leverage did coal miners possess?
Hey, Chris A.
Hey, yeah. Well, coal being essential for manufacture of steel, put them at a great leverage. I don't know, that being a choke point of industry, gave them the opportunity to hold leverage. I don't know. Would that be all right answer?
Yeah, I think, right, that I think coal was the most important fuel in the country during the 1930s. I mean, it was used for trains, on ships, and in fact, until very recently, it was still the main form of fuel used for production of electricity. Companies have moved away from coal in the past, just really the past 8 or 10 years. But throughout that period, power was largely coal fueled. So they were important to the economy. And we can compare them to, let's say, Starbucks workers today. What the Starbucks workers are doing is inspirational, but they don't have a lot of structural power, right?
Katie?
There are 10 to 15,000 Starbucks things in the United States, and these figures are general because there are Starbucks places in grocery stores and at airports and whatnot, and that aren't necessarily owned by Starbucks. There are about 40,000 coffee shops in the country, maybe 60 or 70,000 if you count Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's as coffee places, right? So if all the Starbucks workers organized and went on strike, it wouldn't keep any of us from getting coffee at a coffee shop, right? On the other hand, if railroad workers or truck drivers all went on strike, the economy would grind to a halt and we would all be affected. So that's a difference in structural power. And that isn't to say that it isn't pretty cool that Starbucks workers are organizing, but in looking at type of leverage that workers have, there's a difference. And coal miners had a lot of leverage during the 1930s and 1940s and have very little at present. Well, let's try another one.
I'll put my regular hand up too. I was going to jump in, if that's okay. I had a really similar to Ollie's comment in the chat. I think the other thing that really stood out to me in reading the chapters was that the way that they were organized, that coal miners were sort of captive, that they were in some ways a homogenous working population, given the way that they were distributed around the country. So the opportunity for consciousness raising, I think you're suggesting in the book, which is a really interesting argument, that bred for more activism and militancy.
Yeah, no, I think that so coal miners were different depending on the places in the country, racially and ethnically. If anybody's seen the film Matewan, you see that there's immigrant workers and native white workers and black workers, and they initially don't mesh until they finally unite. But coal miners had a lot of leverage, and we can even compare them to textile workers, which were a main industry in the South, particularly in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama. Nobody goes into a coal mine without experienced co-workers. Coal miners were digging holes, blowing up coal seams with dynamite. If you didn't know what you were doing, you didn't, I mean, it was bad enough for the people who knew what they were doing, working in coal mines. And if you didn't know what you were doing, that's the last place that you would want to be. Textile workers, as we can see today, can be trained very quickly. As opposed to coal mines, textile plants move around. They not only left the United States, a lot of them have left China and have gone to places where labor is cheaper. Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh. So we can look at the type of leverage that people have. And I think the homogeneity, one of the problems with a place like Mercedes is that there's 8,000 workers, or whatever the number is today, working for a very powerful company. Coal mines tend to have 300-400, even the big one, what's the one that went on strike for so long in Alabama, just blocking on the name, but they had 1,000 workers. So we're talking about much smaller things, and they're owned by smaller companies. So there's much greater hurdles, even though auto workers for Mercedes have a lot of structural powers. There's more hurdles in terms of them organizing than there were for smaller workplaces. But I think the homogeneity question in terms of the work is also important, right? Well, part of this, so part of this I mentioned, but what about structural power and who has it today? Or why do auto workers have structural power? Or we could compare them to railroad workers or truck drivers. I'm hoping that I don't have, in asking the questions, I don't have to answer them also. Okay, I'll try to give a little bit of an answer to this one and then try to ask a question that I won't answer. But so the reason auto is the premier consumer good in this country. Everybody, not everybody, but a large percentage of the population has automobiles. It's by far the most expensive consumer product. Needs to be replaced, unfortunately, fairly often. Aside from almost 1 million auto workers, automobile production draws on products from a huge number of other industries, both at home and abroad, from tires and plastics and everything else. In addition, and this may be the way, as opposed to, I don't know, washing machines or refrigerators, there are 1,000 repair workers, automobile repair workers in the United States, and there are 1 million repair workers and 2 million people involved in sales of automobiles, right? You go down a big highway in this country and automobile dealerships are all over the place, right? More than, except maybe for grocery stores, more than most other things. So auto plays a huge role in the economy. Used to be that it used a large percentage of the steel and aluminum. I don't know, someone else probably knows more about the composition of automobiles these days, but it uses less of those things. So that's why auto is important. And the other thing is, as we know internationally, with all the subsidies that Ben mentions in his article for batteries and EV production, there's global competition. And even with the United States, with transplants, there's competition too. So if unionization happens in auto companies, or if they go on strike, it's a big type of leverage for the economy. What was the wall-to-wall approach of the coal miners, and how is that relevant for us today? Maybe we should maybe my questions aren't so hot. Let's see.
I actually missed the last question. What was that one more time?
What was the wall-to-wall approach of the coal miners, particularly in Alabama? And how is this relevant for us today?
Well, once they organized in the mines, they moved on to other industries and occupations that were more or less connected. They went on to farmers and so on and so forth.
And how did this help the coal miners? Or how did this help other workers?
Well, they provided leadership and support for the organizational efforts of other workers.
Chris,
And they're able to build like a critical mass of like workers who can go on strike at once and act collectively.
Okay, sounds good.
Chris, go ahead. Chris A.
Yeah, I was just saying, supporting with solidarity strikes along the supply chain. Also, allowing others to use the resources for which they'd already garnered in their unions.
So
Right.
we had any mass mobilizations of workers to support other workers? Any wall-to-wall organizing going on today?
Well, I actually had a question regarding that Kentucky plant that you were talking about. Do you know which construction unions participated and what was their level of I don't know, coordination and attempt to, I don't know, what were they trying to do and who was doing it?
Yeah, so it was coalition of all the main construction unions, starting in the state of Kentucky, but they also got support nationally from the construction unions. There's the article that I put up there talks about that a little bit. I had a student at Wayne State who wrote about the failures of the auto workers in organizing the Georgetown Toyota plant. And she also had a lot of detail on the success of the construction unions. So they had big demonstrations. They exposed environmental degradation that the company was planning to do with non-union labor. So they mobilized other groups to help support them. They had big demonstrations in the area and in the state capitol. And they created, so they didn't just talk and lobby, they actually mobilized lots of people. And they got unions in the surrounding states saying that they would not let unionized construction workers have anything to do with Toyota. So it was a combination of publicity, but mobilizing people. They had demonstrations of thousands of construction workers. And originally Toyota had a Japanese non-union firm, which was going to hire non-union construction workers in terms of building the plant. And then they planned on using non-union contractors for the jobs in the plant. And the jobs in the plant, I worked in an auto plant for a long time, quite a while ago, but some of the jobs are different. While there are electricians and plumbers, there's also millwrights who move machinery. There's high-level machinists and tool makers and other people who aren't strictly construction workers. But some of the work in the plant in terms of plumbers and electricians are similar to construction workers. Electricians quite a few decades ago had to start learning about digitally controlled machines and that sort of thing, something different than if they're building a house for you. But it's still the same trade. So they engaged in mobilization, whereas with the first campaigns in Chattanooga, the UAW said they wanted to have cooperative relations with Toyota. The construction unions didn't say that at all. They said that if you don't hire all union labor, we're going to make life miserable for you, which they started to do. And eventually Toyota caved in. And that newspaper clipping that I have on the PowerPoint has basically the company's concession statement in it.
So Rust has a hand raised. Rust, if you want to go. Oh, you're muted. Still.
If wall to wall, my understanding of wall to wall means you organize everybody in the workforce, regardless of skill level. And in the case of coal, where one lump of coal from one mine is pretty much the same as a lump of coal from another mine, you have to organize regionally, control the marketplace for coal. But I would think the main thing to say about wall to wall in the miners' case is they organized interracially, and there were plenty of black miners, many of whom have been convict laborers in the mines. And if you weren't from that background, if you were white, you weren't going to get anywhere organizing your fellow miners if you had a color bar. So I would think the main thing that the miners, set the mark for was that they were willing, in a period where very few other unions were, to organize on an interracial basis. And in that sense, they were doing wall to wall.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the mine workers were very impressive in terms of reaching the color line in the South, which was very rigid at that time. And this was particularly true in Alabama, where half the coal miners were African American, but it was also true. It was also true in West Virginia, which became the largest coal field, where a quarter of the mine workers were African American. So I think that that's the point that your name is Rust, right? Yeah, the point that Rust make is important, and we can extend that today, right? There are other. It's no longer just black and white workers, coal miners, auto workers, people who work at warehouses in the supply chain, are a variety of races and ethnic groups, and much larger percentage female today than they were during the 1930s and 1940s, with the exception of textile, which was a high percentage of females in the 1930s.
Dan Taylor also added in the chat that Taft-Hartley has been harmful for banning secondary strikes. And I will turn over to Ashaki, who has a hand raised.
Great, thank you. I don't know if I'm driving, so I'm unsure if people can hear me or not.
You can hear you.
Okay, I really want to appreciate Mr. Goldfield's presentation thus far, and been enjoying the book. I haven't finished it, so I don't know if I'm 100% in unity, but I did want to, say that raised about, auto being the backbone of, the economy in the United States and also in the world, and it's a bone, if the backbone. And a little at bang with the significance of the auto industry. It's a worldwide industry of capitalism internationally. And then on this question of wall to wall, I wanted to agree with what Gus was saying, that wall to wall organizing would be
Ashaki, you're breaking up a little bit. Could you repeat that last part from wall to wall organizing?
Yeah, this is what I was afraid of when I didn't raise my hand. I didn't know if I would be breaking up. But I was saying that, the significance of wall-to-wall organizing in terms of the organizing reaching into every sector of that.
I think we lost her. Yeah, she's dropped off, unfortunately. Hopefully she'll get back on. Katie?
Thinking a little bit about the contemporary connection to and the wall-to-wall significance. I think like some of the Amazon, especially thinking about Bessemer and some of the Amazon battles, they have a really uphill battle because Amazon's a pretty good job. If there's not other unionized or good jobs in the area, it makes it harder to organize. It makes it harder to organize in that kind of a workplace. If your wages are already higher than you might be getting elsewhere, it's a big obstacle. So that was part of the strategy as well.
Meredith?
See if I can unmute. I'm thinking about how this applies in a couple, like two sectors, I guess. And the first one would be the fight for 15. How like the wage workers have and continue to across retail establishments, especially in the fast food industry, push for higher wages, and how the farm workers, at least in the 60s and 70s, like especially had that sort of starting in the West, like in California, but like continuing and spreading, like they were able to unionize across regions in the United Farm Workers. And that could possibly be like an application of this.
So, yeah, so certainly national, as several people have emphasized, nationalizing struggles is important. I mean, we can see the problems, for example, of railroad workers. If all the railroad workers stopped work, the economy would stop, right? 40% of the goods in the country go by rail, and certainly most of the bigger products, food and smaller things, tend to go exclusively by truck. But railroad workers are unionized, but there are 14 different unions that don't agree on anything, or that mostly don't agree on anything. And the opposition group, Railroad Workers United, is trying to amalgamate all the workers. So I think that, I mean, and that's the challenge that the United Auto Workers faces, of organizing all of the auto workers, so the leverage is that much greater, and that's why the Southern auto workers are so key to having that leverage. Well, what? So the South also plays an important role in the supply chain and the logistics industry. The largest inland port is in Laredo, Texas. I've been down there in a long time, but if you see the pictures, there are just miles and miles of warehouses with trucks pulling in and out. The Bessemer Amazon one. So some of the hubs, Louisville, which is sort of the South, right? Fringe anyway. The logistics hubs in Louisville and in Memphis are huge. UPS and FedEx have major hubs in those areas. So if those workers, warehouse workers and other logistics workers, can organize, they have a lot of leverage, right? So they're very components of looking at what leverage people have. But the other thing is, workers that don't have a lot of leverage need more support, which we'll talk about maybe next time. So one of the things that characterized Alabama is that in a couple places, when laundry workers who did not have a lot of structural power went on strike and the companies tried to fire them, thousands of unionized workers showed up to support them. Steel workers, iron ore workers, coal miners, and that carried the day for those people. We haven't seen a lot of that today, right? But the possibilities exist.
Ashaki, are you back?
Well, I'm back, but I'm a little bit hesitant to start talking again because I don't want to get dropped here. But I would just say that I really appreciate this study that we're doing, and my only comment kind of dovetails with some of the others about the wall to wall. One of the reasons why it's so important today is not only for the auto industry across the South, but one of the ways that unions have been undermined is to almost force them to go back to a type of craft unionism or something where among teachers, for example, the teachers may be organized, but in many places, the editorial staff and all, sometimes they're not. And so the union, so places like that, still where the organization is not taking place on an industrial basis, the least skilled to the most skilled workers into the same union, and that way everybody's protecting each other and supporting each other. And so it's a very important concept.
Like we lost her again.
Sorry, guys.
But I think the point's an important one. I mean, the interesting thing, I mean, we've had these mini upsurges. A few years ago, there were teachers' strikes, particularly in Republican-controlled states, the red state. And I don't know if I can bring this back up, but I've got some pictures. I got a picture of 3,000 teachers in Oklahoma occupying the State House. And they forced the legislature to raise money and allocate more money for teachers, right? Teachers are mostly unionized, but as we know, school teachers tend to be pretty underpaid, right? In most places. All the stories we hear about teachers having to buy supplies for their students out of their own pockets. Class size is too big to work with people who need help. Right? We all know about that, right? So this has led to historically lots of militancy among teachers and high unionization rate among public school teachers. So where is the next upsurge of militancy and unionization likely to come from in the South? Any speculation? I mean, we're all hopeful. We're all working on this, right?
Ollie in the chat said North Carolina warehouse workers. And Chris A has a hand up. Go ahead.
One thing that we're seeing in Virginia is a lot of data centers are being built, or at least in the pre-approval stage, and it's coming further and further south. Like as places in Northern Virginia are filling up capacity for power, power distribution. It's coming further and further south and like using areas that are less filled to capacity in terms of what they can provide power for. Data centers are unique in like what they provide, in that it could be essential or non-essential, but they're coming and they're like one of the biggest development projects we've been seeing. I hope to see that at least in the building trades that can produce a lot more unionization efforts. I don't know. And then also production of power for those facilities.
So do you see if data center workers unionized, them having a lot of leverage?
So the data center workers, like people who actually man that, like from the company, it's a weird situation because they'll have like a center that then leases out to different companies, and you'll have like one that like leases this many spaces to, you know, a certain provider, and you know, you don't have that many individual employees, but what you do have is a lot of maintenance workers and a lot of construction workers building them. So in terms of staffing, possibly not, but in building them, yes.
So at least last year when I saw figures for Amazon employment, they had 30 data centers, and I think 26 or 28 were in Northern Virginia. So that's a real center for these data centers, right? I don't know where exactly are we talking about, in Arlington or Alexandria?
Loudoun County, Virginia has the most data centers, I believe, which is this maybe 30 minutes south of DC.
Actually, the largest concentration of data centers in the world in Northern Virginia.
See Vijay, the hand up.
I was just gonna say, I think another like kind of obvious answer is obviously electric vehicle, not just OEM production of the cars themselves, but the entire supply chain of it. And that includes like battery recycling, as well as the chip production that'll come with EVs, as well as like all the raw materials that come in and the input and intermediate industries that are along the way. Because right now there's like $100 billion in private capital investment in EV in the South alone, and they want to see that return. So I think that's a lot of power that a lot of workers will have.
If they organize, right?
Right. And do it effectively.
William?
Yeah, I was just wondering, so when you talk about structural power, you know, and capital investment, or at least from what I understand, your point of the importance of capital investment, but also maybe not the ease of like in the case of the miners, of these mines can't just be moved, the locality of that gave some structural power to the miners, and then the wall to wall. And I'm wondering how this fits in. We talked just briefly about teachers, but healthcare, in the sense that there's huge capital investment, but we definitely see that with healthcare unions, even the most militant, you're not going to find wall to wall now, which I think has been a real weakness of the healthcare unionizing efforts. But also how it's difficult to replace these really highly skilled workers, or some of them. But then I'm just thinking of several things, trying to apply that to something like healthcare, in the sense that you talk about the textile, the difficulty of organizing textile workers because not having the same structural power. And then you mentioned India and how it was linked to the independence movement, and how that broadened their support. And I'm wondering if there's parallels or major differences as far as an industry that has heavy capital investment, also consolidation of these big corporations, and then locality. If there's, I don't know, any thoughts you have on that to healthcare.
No, I think that's an important point. And first, there is a question of replacement. So textile workers are easy to replace. So I work for a company that doesn't exist, but a construction equipment company, International Harvester, and they spun off when they went bankrupt, and they make trucks and engines, Navistar. But older workers told me when they set up the plant, it took them a year or two to get production up. And a lot of that was involved not just in equipment, but training people. And you can't underestimate, semi-skilled labor and what it takes for people to be efficient. So auto companies not only have a lot of capital investment, but they have workforces that they've trained, and they're able to run things. It's one thing to it's easy to replace people in a warehouse, even though there may be a lot of capital investment. Amazon has a very high turnover rate in their warehouses. But if you're manufacturing batteries or vehicles, and we can see the companies. So I'm north of Seattle. We can see how Boeing shot themselves in the foot by fighting unions and outsourcing things to cheap producers. They had 20,000 highly skilled workers, and they basically screwed most of them. And they cut back, and they lost quality control and whatnot, and the company's in big trouble now. So they shot themselves in the foot by trying to cut costs in ways that didn't make sense. And it's possible that auto companies and battery manufacturers could put themselves in the same situation. So, yeah, and I think that these are sunk, the 100 million investment that people want to, or 100 billion, excuse me, that people want to, that capitalists want to return on, is not easily picked up and moved to someplace else once they commit to it. And that's also why I would argue that the things that these Republican governors and politicians say don't mean much. They're not going to pull the plug on these companies. The subsidies and the contracts and the tax breaks are contractual over long periods of time, and they're pretty difficult to change. Yeah, so there are difficulties, but there are also opportunities.
Couple more that went into the chat. Service workers, auto workers, workers who are being replaced by AI. Has comments on any of those? Dan Taylor said the electric vehicle transition will increase to domestic mining for critical minerals. And there's a cobalt mine opening in North Carolina, Ollie says.
Ben, do you want to try and ask a provocative question?
Ask a provocative question. I'm curious, like, there's a lot of folks here from different parts of the region and different industries. I think thinking about these questions, and particularly the approach, I think your last question about strategic industries, in a lot of ways makes me think about our approach of building the Southern Workers Assembly, which is, developing networks of worker cadre and, thinking about these questions of power and how do we leverage it, in terms of going deep in one facility versus, spreading out across a market and building, cadre that are engaging in collective action, building committees. And so I'm curious, like how some of the, what folks read in the book and thinking about some of these questions about strategic industry kind of land with you and the work that you're engaged in at your own workplace, or, through the workers' assemblies that folks are a part of, or other organizing that you're involved in. And what we might be able to draw from some of, the historical lessons and, whatever lessons folks are kind of learning in their day-to-day struggles, that you're engaged in today.
Hey, Ben, could you synthesize that one down, that last question?
I mean, I just like in terms of, drawing from the historical lessons that are in the Southern Key, thinking about, generally the SWA methodology, the work that many of you are doing in your own workplaces, I guess, just curious what lessons, folks are discovering in that work or learning that might be helpful to others, or what kind of, thinking about this question of industries and where we can concentrate, efforts, as far as, these questions of structural power, associational power, what kind of comes to mind from, thinking about your practice and and some of these, lessons that we're trying to draw from. I don't know if that's much of a synthesis, but hopefully there's something that people can respond to in there.
Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing positive about our model that I will say sort of that gets at some of the lessons here for me is this sort of like the concept and practice of solidarity in general, and having each other's backs, different workers in different sectors across different unions. I mean, I think historically, like unions can be kind of isolated and turfy about like things, and we can't allow that to happen, and we can't allow, like, if there's a setback here or there in terms of organizing in the South for organize, for people to give up and then just decide they're not going to continue the effort, and allow sort of artificial divisions. I think in the past, there was a lot of successful red baiting and things related to sort of like racial divisions that were used to combat organizing in the South. And I think, the remedy to that is with that.
So you think the red baiting is falling flat? I mean, if Kamala Harris is being called a communist by Trump, where does that leave the rest of us, right? I mean, this is sort of crazy, right? But so I think one lesson to learn also is that one never knows where things are going to break out and where the next upsurge is going to come. So the interesting thing is you had communists and socialists in particular throughout the 20s who were in small groups in these huge plants, and they secretly put out leaflets and newsletters and maybe draw a couple workers here and there. And when things broke loose, they had already built a network of support that they were able to draw upon. And just the idea of getting information out to people about what's going on in other parts of the workplace often has a stimulating effect on people. There was an article in the paper today about nurses organizing in the New York City area, and how the company had been trying to fire one of the leaders of the nurses union. And the types of things that the workers, that particularly the pandemic drew all these healthcare workers together, because the conditions particularly in New York City, were so dire. And they created a great deal of solidarity and militancy, which still exists today. You know, people thought the organizing of Chattanooga might have been a breakthrough. But, you know, and it may still well be, but nothing dramatic has happened since then, but it still may. All we can do is dare to struggle, dare to win, right?
You know, in terms of the power of solidarity and how we link these struggles, I think the recent Daimler Truck International contract battle is a really good example of where, especially the Southern Workers Assembly, was able to put these things into practice as far as trying to broaden this out and relate it to other workplaces, unionized and not unionized. And people were eager as can be, because I feel like many unions were so out of practice. And I think that happens a lot. We just had another successful union win down the street from the Thomas Built Buses plant. And I don't think it's by accident that, you know, this is the third time was the winner. But, you know, they saw the example of these workers that got a really strong contract, that practiced, you know, pickets. We had Teamsters put out a letter of solidarity. We had the North Carolina Association of Educators did the same. And we had, you know, a lot of photos and these practice strikes where we had workers coming from different places. I think some of this seems really simple. It's just not been done the way it was 60 plus years ago on a regular basis. And it seemed to really pay off in the Daimler contract struggle recently.
No, I think that's good. I mean, the Daimler situation is sort of underreported, right? I mean, compared to Chattanooga or the big three stand-up strikes.
Right.
Al?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the struggle that Libby mentions in the chat with the teachers in Northern Virginia. It's such at least in Virginia, really important to see those two unions merging together to win that union recognition there. Of course, you know, we have kind of a weird situation across the state now with the new collective bargaining laws that kind of kick the issue down to the local school boards and city councils all across the state. But those two unions had been battling each other for decades, raiding each other and having all kinds of territorial issues. And for them to come together and win this enormous amount of victory in Northern Virginia, I think will really, have an impact across the state and show what solidarity can accomplish.
Libby?
Hi, thanks, Chelsea. I did want to speak to the importance of cadre building and having a broad network. Mike, thanks so much for this discussion tonight. I think it's really important to be thinking about, if a breakthrough comes, will people be ready? Will they have a network to draw upon? Will they be able to move forward and take advantage of an opportunity that a breakthrough provides? In SWA, we actually think that organizing cannot happen in a linear way. Like you can't organize one place and then start from zero at the next place. Because if it takes a year to organize each place, how many workplaces are there and how many years do we have? Not a lot. So we just think it's really important to have this broad network of cadre throughout the South so that when the breakthrough comes, because I don't think it's if, I think it's when the breakthrough comes, people need to see the opportunity and seize it and really go from where we are today to a very different place in terms of the political and economic structure.
Russell in the chat pulled out 2 lessons, 1, interracial solidarity, and 2, rank and file leadership instead of depending on remote professional leadership. Anybody else? Some final lessons? Mike, any last things that we need to talk about? Persistence.
Yeah.
I have one last a question though, that when Libby brought up about the importance of building cadre, but as you know, the union, we all recognize that it's things have not been happening the way they were for this really strong period that you write about in the book. But does this open up an opportunity from that, like that last question about the importance of rank and file organizing, in the sense that, you know, a lot of this was from the inside out that knocked down the really strong rank and file organizing? And do you see this kind of as an opening right now because, you know, the leadership is not as much focused on repressing that because the unions are really weak, and the, I don't know, do you see some real openings for rank and file organizing in the current period?
Yeah, I think so. I think the unions, before the 1930s, most of the unions were pretty lethargic and bureaucratic, similar to what some of us recognize today. So I worked in a large plant in Illinois, but I was also involved not just in the local, but at the regional level in certain things. And the organizing people sat behind the desk, occasionally went out to pass out cards in front of plants and didn't get too far, right? And the breakthroughs that took place through, at least initially, through rank and file groups in the plant. And so on the West Coast, the Longshore Union was pretty corrupt and in bed with the company, and rank and file groups led the upsurge of longshore workers and a massive strike, which also enthused lumber workers and all sorts of other people when it took place. And I think that, you know, it's small groups of people that initiate those things. One of the things is people are hesitant when they're worried about losing their job. They don't think that things can be very successful. And that's why union and labor movement growth takes place in explosive ways. All of a sudden the dam breaks and everybody decides that now is the time, right? So, you know, organizing campaigns are interesting, but they don't tend to quite enthuse people the way massive strikes do. I mean, I think that's another lesson from the, you know, from the 1930s. So we'll see. But I think building those networks in the plant has to be the center of what I can't remember who, was that Libby who mentioned that? That has to be the center point of what people are doing now. Huh?
Anyone else chime in before we hop off? Yeah, Jody?
Yeah, thanks so much to Mike and Chelsea. This has been really, really useful. I just wanted to encourage everybody to, bring this back to your local assemblies and unions, and then, based on that, maybe we can come to this next study session with some questions or points that were raised there. But yeah, this was incredibly valuable. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I hope we all got something out of it and enjoyed ourselves a little bit.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. This was great. Ben, any last things we need to know this same time next week, right?
Yeah, and just want to thank again Mike and Chelsea for leading this discussion tonight. And yeah, the next session will be next week at the same time at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central. There's another, I think it's chapter 3 that we're looking at next time. There's a couple of other pages that Mike has suggested that we add into the mix, and another set of questions that we'll send out by email to everyone. Hope tomorrow or over the weekend we'll send that out. But yeah, thanks everybody for joining. Yeah, thanks again, Mike and Chelsea, and we'll see you all in a week.
Looking forward to it. Bye.
All right. Good night, y'all.
All right. Thanks.